Hello and welcome to Coronavirus Catch Up. I'm Jordan Kenny. We're live tonight on the BBC News NI website and Facebook page and on the BBC iPlayer for the next 20 minutes or so. Thanks for tuning in, however you're joining us. So we're currently in week 8 of lockdown here in Northern Ireland, which meant it was review week for ministers. They've spent most of today trying to decide what the next steps would be in tackling the pandemic here. They've had lots to consider. There's been schools, the vaccine rollout, the hospitality sector, non-essential retail, just to name a few. However, they did reach some decisions. I'm sure you'll already know, but just after 4 o'clock this afternoon, the First Minister, Arlene Foster, and Finance Minister, Conor Murphy, announced that the lockdown would be extended here in Northern Ireland until the 1st of April. So that means the current restrictions that were due to end on the 5th of March will now be extended for pretty much another 4 weeks. Another one of the headlines is that schools in Northern Ireland are to begin a phased return, starting with primaries 1 to 3 from the 8th of March. We've been inundated with questions tonight, more than we've ever had before. So here to go through them with me and to help unpack all of this is our political reporter, Jane McCormack. Jane, another busy day. Thanks for coming on.
Seeing me in the office here because it's been a pretty busy day, but good to be back.
Yeah, Jane, it looks like we're not going to be noticing much difference for the next while at least. Does this come as a bit of a surprise given the fact that cases have been falling and the R number remains below 1?
You're right about the numbers having fallen, Jordan, but I actually don't think that today's decision by the executive to keep the restrictions in place until April does come as a surprise, because I think they've been hinting pretty strongly to the public throughout the last few weeks that even though the numbers are going in the right direction and we've seen the pressure on our hospitals start to fall quite a lot as well, what they're saying is that we're really not far enough through this yet. And one of the other things that we heard Arlene Foster talk about today that we haven't really had to consider before is the effect of having this new variant of coronavirus in Northern Ireland. So that Kent variant from England that was discovered before Christmas, it's now thought to account for about 70% of COVID cases in Northern Ireland. And so that was what Arlene Foster was saying played a factor in their decision to keep restrictions in place, because they point to the Republic of Ireland where lockdown was lifted before Christmas. The Kent variant was there. Suddenly there was a huge spike in cases, and before you know it, things were out of control again. So that is what ministers don't want to see. That being said, they also know that this last 2-month period for people has been incredibly difficult. People have been struggling with their livelihoods, mental health, and so they know that pretty soon they're going to have to start formulating a plan to help get people out of it and start to move us beyond this period of lockdown. But unfortunately, we're not there yet.
Well, we're mentioning the case numbers there, Jane. Before we go any further, let's just take a quick look at the latest figures from the Department of Health from today. 6 more people have died after testing positive for COVID-19 in the last 24 hours. The death toll now stands at 2,021. A further 342 cases have also been reported. And there are 418 people being treated for the virus in hospitals here. 51 are in intensive care units and 42 are on ventilators. The reproduction number, or R number as you might know it, has come down by 0.05 in the past week and is now sitting at between 0.7 and 0.8. And briefly on vaccines, 457,581 vaccines have now been given out in Northern Ireland. And of that number, 427,569 are first doses. 30,012 people have had both their first and second jab of the vaccine. But Jane, to come back to you, one of the biggest talking points from today is schools. I mean, most pupils haven't been back in classrooms since before Christmas. What does this phased return mean? Who will be back and when?
Okay, so it's a pretty complicated picture, I think, but we'll try and set this out for you, what we've learned today. So from the 8th of March, ministers have decided to allow this phased return to begin. So on that date, we're going to see children in primary 1 to primary 3 going back to full-time learning. And then the following few weeks ahead, then the 22nd of March, we're going to see students who are doing their who were meant to do their GCSEs, A-levels, that kind of thing. So years 12 to 14, and those who were due to do BTECs, they will then go back on the 22nd of March. But there's a bit of a caveat around that date then, because ministers are saying that in order to allow those later year groups to go back, they're then going to have to require those nursery groups and children in P1 to P3 to do another week of remote learning ahead of the Easter break. And then the overall intention after Easter is to hopefully try and begin that phased process to allow P4 to P7 children and those in sort of year 8 up to year 11 in secondary and grammar schools to then go back to school. But clearly there's a lot of work to be done around this. Teachers are being given notice of this now to help them plan, and we're told as well that there's going to have to be additional safety measures in the classrooms, more face coverings being worn by students and teachers potentially, and there's going to be more signage around keeping your distance in classrooms. So I think it's still a bit of a work in progress, but clearly the executive wants its top priority to be getting schools reopened on a full-time basis, because at the moment, as we know, they're only open for special schools and for children of key workers and vulnerable children to go into those classrooms for childcare purposes. And I should just mention as well, the executive told us today that even when those first classes begin again in mainstream schools, children who are vulnerable or who are the kids of key workers and have been going to classrooms during the lockdown, they will still be able to attend the classroom. So it's just important to clear that up.
Well, Jane, we've had so many questions in about schools tonight as well. Julie's in touch and she's asking why it has been decided the way it has. She says, surely P1 to 3 can catch up. P6 kids need to be in school to prep for their AQE exams. Is that something ministers will have taken into consideration today when making these decisions?
It's definitely something that will have been discussed around the virtual executive table. It's not for us to give the justifications as to what has been decided and who's going back and who isn't. That's clearly for ministers to answer. But what we heard from Arlene Foster and Conor Murphy at today's press conference was that the advice they've received around who can go back and who can't at the moment points to the virus being more transmissible in those children that are older. However, Arlene Foster was then stressing that they know that those children, those older students who were due to do their exams who now aren't getting to, they still need to be back in the classrooms in order to get assessed and do work so that they can have their predicted grades from teachers and that kind of thing coming together. So they've had to take decisions. It's obviously not going to please everybody because homeschooling has been so tough for so many parents and pupils. But this is the decision that they've taken. They've said they'll keep it under review, and if they have to make changes further down the line, then they'll do that.
Well, we have a question in here, Jane, from Gemma, and I know you've mentioned this, but just to kind of reiterate again, I know Arlene Foster was mentioning it at the press conference earlier. The children of key workers will still be catered for when the phased return begins.
Yeah, so we'll repeat that for people because obviously that is something that this time I think more key workers have taken advantage of because clearly more people have had to work during the pandemic and maybe haven't been able to do so from home, and there has been a wider definition set this time for those key workers who can then send their children into the classroom. So they will still be able to send their kids into school even if they don't meet that criteria for those who are going back to face-to-face learning, and of course for those children who are deemed vulnerable as well, they will still be able to go into classrooms as well. So I think that's important to set that out.
Well, Gavin is asking Jane about early vaccination for teachers. This is obviously a sensitive topic as many people are in positions where a case could be argued, I suppose, about early vaccinations. But does this return to classrooms strengthen the case of teachers when it comes to early access to vaccines?
I think that is something that some of the teachers' unions potentially will say. It strengthens their argument around that. And we know that some of the political parties at Stormont have also made the case for teachers to get priority vaccinations. That being said, I mean, it's a discussion that the executive has had before when they looked at giving priority vaccinations to special school teachers. Now, they did agree to give them to special school staff who worked very closely with those children, but they didn't agree it for teachers more widely in those schools. So you'd have thought that this is a discussion that's probably going to crop up around the executive table again in the next few weeks and months. But the problem is, once you pick one group to prioritise of key workers, then it becomes, well, what about policemen, for example? What about other key workers who work on the front line, transport workers, for example? So it opens up a whole Pandora's box. But if they're deciding that they want schools to be the priority to reopen, then they may well have to consider giving priority vaccines out as well. So we'll have to wait and see what happens with that.
Yeah, like you say, obviously a very delicate issue that we'll just have to wait to hear more about. But just a reminder before we go any further, if you are watching on Facebook, feel free to get involved in the comment section. If you have any thoughts or questions about what's being discussed, just put them in there and we will try our best to get to them before we're off air. But moving away from schools here, Jane, we've had this in from John, and he's asking, why don't we propose very small steps to returning to normal rather than the all or nothing approach we've taken to date so far in this lockdown? Come Saturday, Jane, this will be the longest we've been in lockdown without restrictions changing in any way, even beating the lockdown in 2020. Is there a reluctance to open things up faster this time around?
I think, in fairness to ministers at Stormont, lessons have been learned this time, Jordan, because when you ask them why we aren't opening up sooner, they point to what happened before Christmas and after Christmas when they allowed restrictions to be eased. And then in January, we saw that massive pressure on the health service, particular strains, and of course, record numbers of coronavirus cases, hospital admissions and deaths as well, and the numbers of people in intensive care absolutely rocketing. So they don't want that to happen again. And so when you speak to them about why things aren't moving quicker, they say they're taking all of the public health advice on board. They want to ensure that whenever we do come out of lockdown this time, it's done in a safe and sustainable way so that we don't end up going back into another lockdown in a matter of weeks. And so that's why this time in particular, Robin Swan was calling for lockdown to be extended until April, because that then takes in Mother's Day, St. Patrick's Day. Obviously, those are times where normally a lot of us would go and meet up with friends and family, and he doesn't want to lead to any risks of another spike in cases around that happening. So that's why that has happened. But obviously, I think there is going to be a bit of pressure on ministers now to start setting out how we emerge from lockdown in later parts of the spring, because people are really starting to feel it now.
Yeah. Well, this next question, it's not from me, might I add, just somebody else with a great name, but Jordan has got in touch about off sales and regulations in place for selling alcohol. Are we expecting any changes to be made soon around the sale of alcohol, Jane? Because let's not forget, supermarkets and off licenses still aren't able to sell alcohol after 8 p.m.
Yeah, it isn't something that I have heard there are any plans to change or amend. So I think it's something that they're going to have to come back and look at, because off licenses have never really had to close during the pandemic, but obviously their hours have been restricted. And I think that was done to try and encourage people to obey that stay-at-home order that came into place at the start of the lockdown from Boxing Day. So it's something they're going to have to look at. And I think as we go on through this, it'll probably form part of this wider package of measures that they decide to ease. But as at this point, I still don't know when that might be.
Well, I see there somebody on Facebook is asking about sport. We're going to get on to that in a minute or two. But just before we do, Jane, Angela is asking about what happens come the 1st of April. So obviously we have this review in 1 month's time, but what will the position be over the Easter weekend, for example?
Well, that's a good question, I think, because Finance Minister Conor Murphy today was asked about that, because the restrictions will take us right up to April Fool's Day, the day before the Easter holidays are due to begin on that Friday. And it seems strange to some people that they wouldn't extend the restrictions over the Easter break, given it looks likely that we're not going to see any particular easing of the measures by then. But what Conor Murphy was saying today to people was, don't book ahead. Don't think that for the Easter weekend now all of a sudden everything is going to be back to the way it was before the lockdown. So I think we can take that as a pretty clear signal that even though we haven't seen an extension of the restrictions yet, while we may not be in full lockdown that weekend, you'd have thought the majority of the restrictions will end up staying in place. So I don't think people should be planning to go for dinner, say, for example, or, go and have dinner in somebody's house. So I think we just need to kind of inject a little bit of realism into what might actually be possible around that date.
Yeah, well, we've people on Facebook here asking about golf courses and sport. So let's get into the sport, Jane. We've had so many questions about sport. It's a big part of life for many of us. And while we're able to watch sport on TV at the minute and see the elite athletes taking part, for most of us who aren't elite athletes, the reality is we haven't been able to take part ourselves. Mel has got in touch to ask if a return to outdoor sport is something that's been discussed. Richard's also in touch. He says that we've been told there's less risk of transmission outside. So why can't sports like tennis and golf be played?
Well, I think when you put that question to ministers, what they come back with time and again is that it's not just about the risk of the virus being transmitted during the activity of sport itself, but it's about the congregation of people coming together. So, for example, if you take golf clubs, what we're told is it's not necessarily when people are playing on the golf course where they may be able to socially distance. It tends to be congregating in the actual car park when they arrive or staying around afterwards, and that's when people tend to let their guard down. So that is what we're told tends to kind of lead the health advice that ministers are given on allowing sport to begin again. That being said, I can see why some people are frustrated that whenever there are rules in place that you can meet one person outside your household to go for a walk or to run with somebody, they can't understand why the same couldn't be done to allow golf to continue. I can't answer that. It's for ministers to say why they haven't taken that decision at this time, but clearly it wasn't on the table at the executive meeting today. Certainly Robin Swan hasn't hinted that he is going to allow sport to go ahead anytime soon. So I think we'll just have to play it by ear on that one for now, which I know will disappoint a lot of people.
And obviously, like, a lot of the UK nations have been taking different approaches to different areas of, or different parts of the lockdown. But in Scotland, for instance, golf has been allowed to continue throughout the lockdown. There's plenty of NI golfers looking on with envy, Jane.
Yeah, and I think not just proper sports stars, but I saw I think Stephen Ferris, who was a rugby player, but he's now he wants to get back out in the golf course and was tweeting the executive ministers the other day asking them when could we expect that to happen. So there's certainly pressure around it, and there's no doubt that sport obviously is good, not just for physical health but for mental health. But I think ultimately you have to remember when we went back into lockdown on the 26th of December, things had become really, really bad. And so the executive put in place as many restrictions as it possibly could at that point to try and bring down the R number as low as possible. As you mentioned, we know it's down to 0.75 to 0.85, so it's below 1, which is a good thing. But I think before we start to see any real easing of restrictions, they're going to want that R number to get as low as it possibly can so that we're starting from a low base.
Well, there's people on Facebook here asking about driving tests. We'll come to that shortly. But just before we do, Jane, Helen's asking about gyms. So, now looking at indoor sports, would it be right to presume that we'll have to wait a bit longer for indoor gyms to reopen than we will before we see outdoor sport return?
I can't guess what the executive will do around that, but obviously what we're told around the health advice is that obviously there are fewer risks associated with being outdoors than there are being indoors. I can't remember when gyms were allowed to open in the last sort of easing of lockdown, but certainly they weren't one of the first things to open. So we probably have to be aware that when it comes to the easing of the lockdown and whenever ministers do set out their plan for what they want to happen, the first thing to be aware of is that there are not going to be indicative dates alongside it. Arlene Foster today was saying it's going to be data-led, not date-led. So they're not putting any dates beside things because I think they don't want to get people's hopes up and then have to let them down. And they also know it's hard to plan in a pandemic. We know that by now. We're nearly a year into this. And I think ultimately with gyms and being able to get back in and run on the treadmill, I think we might be a little while away from that yet.
Well, just before we move on from sport, Jane, what can we actually do on the sport front? Owen is asking if there are any initiatives being run to encourage physical activity that could help improve mental health during the pandemic. Is there anything like that?
I don't know off the top of my head in terms of initiatives. I mean, what the executive has set out is that you can obviously go out with your household for exercise and you can meet one other person outside your own household to go for a walk or to go for a run, for example. I don't do a lot of running, so I don't tend to take anybody up on that. But they have little things in place. I think they know, though, that as the nights start to get a bit brighter again as we move into spring, there are going to be more people who want to go out later in the evening and take advantage of being able to go out, given that we've kind of been stuck inside for so long at night now. So they may well have to consider changing the rules around exercise sooner rather than later, but it's up for them to come to that decision based on the advice that comes forward from the health officials.
Well, loads of questions on retail tonight as well, Jane. Jackie is asking about what changes small businesses can expect with click and collect services. There was talk of click and collect earlier at the press conference. What was said?
Yeah, we got a little bit of good news on that front because obviously click and collect services were stopped at the beginning of the lockdown and really only permitted for those larger essential retailers that were allowed to remain open, like supermarkets. So what we were told today is after a good bit of discussion between ministers, they are now going to allow click and collect services for some smaller retailers to begin from Monday, the 8th of March. And we're told that's going to include clothing shops, for example, those places that sell baby goods, because we know it's been difficult for anybody who's had a baby during lockdown to try and get some of those essential things that they need. And also for electrical goods, they'll allow click and collect for those things. I suppose what they would stress is they want to make sure that it's contactless and that people follow the public health advice as much as possible, because the reason that click and collect was stopped last time was because ministers said that they had evidence that some retailers were not using that system properly and that some customers were not following the rules. So we've heard from retailers tonight saying this is really positive news and they want to work with customers and the executive to make sure this is something that can now continue and be a bit of a lifeline for those businesses that have really struggled the past 8 weeks.
Well, Jane, there's obviously so many things we could talk about tonight in so many areas, and a lot of people want to know about areas that are specific to them. So I thought we could do a bit of a quick fire. And I appreciate these are really complex issues and there's a lot to be said about everything that we mentioned tonight. But I thought if we do a bit of a quick fire and run through things, you could kind of tell us a brief give us a brief outlook of where things are at with them. So haircuts, hairdressers, where are things at with them? When will our lockdown mains be tamed? Do we know anything?
I don't know. I mean, I know that's the burning question for most of my friends and people in the office asking about it. I don't know at this stage. It's something that they're going to have to consider. Remember, they weren't the first things to open in the last easing of the lockdown. I think we were about a month and a half on from whenever we first saw shops and that kind of thing open. So I don't think they'll be first in the queue, which is going to disappoint some people who maybe need a bit of a haircut. So it might be a bit of a DIY job for the next couple of months.
Yeah, for those brave enough to give it a go amongst us. Somebody was asking about this on Facebook earlier, but driving lessons and tests, what's happening there?
Again, they're a close contact service and they were kind of included in the similar restrictions as hairdressers and beauty salons, Jordan. So we don't have an update on that at the moment. All we do know is that when it comes to driving tests, obviously there's a system in place through the Department for Infrastructure to cancel and reschedule for those people who have been waiting, let's face it, a pretty long time to try and get their driving license. So I would imagine we'll maybe hear more about that in the next few weeks and months ahead, but there's nothing concrete at the moment.
Yeah, frustrating position for those learner drivers. Weddings, any word on, when civil partnerships and wedding ceremonies could begin to kind of take place in a more traditional way?
Again, I don't know, and I know that's a question that a lot of people will have, especially if you've been trying to plan throughout the last year and you've had to push things back time and again. Obviously, you can have a wedding ceremony or a civil partnership with 25 people, but you can't have a reception at the minute. You can't really do any of the standard things you'd expect at a wedding. I think the executive would love to try and change that when it's safe to do so, but we know at the minute, even when it comes to gatherings, I mean, that it's very restricted at the moment, and we only found out today that from Monday the 8th of March, gatherings in a public space are going to go up from 6 people in 2 households to 10 people from 2 households. So I don't get the sense that we're moving back towards wider numbers at weddings anytime soon.
We'll finish with this one, but on Facebook, there's a few people getting in touch about caravan parks. What about holiday homes, caravan parks? A lot of us are looking ahead to the summer months and wondering what position we're going to be in. Anything you can tell us on that front?
I mean, I think if you speak to ministers at Stormont, they will say privately that they would hope that people would be able to get staycations, maybe, towards the end of May, June, summertime, because obviously they know that's going to be a really crucial period for the tourism industry here, because they effectively haven't really had much work for most of the past year. But at the minute, we don't know, because the rule remains stay at home unless you have to leave for essential reasons. So people shouldn't be doing it at the moment, but we don't know when the executive yet will allow that to go ahead.
Well, finally, Jane, just before we finish, Jim has got in touch. He says that today's announcement just seems like another kick in the teeth. We're almost a year on from the beginning of the pandemic. People are weary of the restrictions. Do we know when we might get a clear roadmap out of this lockdown?
We do, because we learned that today. So Arlene Foster said that she and the Deputy First Minister Michelle O'Neill will be coming to the Stormont Assembly on Monday, the 1st of March, to set out the pathway to recovery blueprint. So that is significant news, because for a few weeks now we had been asking when this might happen and we didn't know when. Obviously Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, is setting out his roadmap for England to start recovery on the 22nd of February. He'll be putting out that plan. So we were wondering when we might get one. As I said earlier, though, I think we just need to be cautious that it's not going to include dates alongside it, similar to the way that the last one didn't either. It was 5 steps, and it's set out whenever some sectors might start to reopen, but it's going to be led by what ministers are told in terms of the science and in terms of the data they're being presented with. So while it will give businesses and people a bit of hope, a bit of light there, I think we need to be careful with it, in that it obviously it's not going to have those thresholds around when things can actually be lifted. But obviously, the vaccine program is here. It's playing a big role. I think it's really good that we've got that now, because we didn't have that at this stage last year when we were leaving the first lockdown. So that, I think, will make a big difference when we eventually get into those later spring months.
Yeah, well, I think that's a cautiously positive note, a good way to finish. Jane, we've covered a lot of ground there. There's literally hundreds of questions that have been sent in that we haven't been able to get to tonight, but thanks so much for coming on and going through all that with us. Like I said, there's so many questions we weren't able to get to tonight, but if you did get in touch with us and send in a question, thanks for doing that. Hopefully the questions we have answered tonight will have helped explain to you where things are at the minute and what's coming up in the next few weeks. Don't forget, you can keep up to date with all the latest developments on the BBC News NI website, which you'll find at bbc.co.uk/newsni. We're on social media as well. You'll be able to find us on Facebook, or if you're watching on Facebook, you probably already have, but we're on Instagram, Twitter and YouTube as well. Just type in BBC News NI on any of those platforms and you should find us. We'll be back with another coronavirus catch up again at the same time next week, but until then, stay safe.